The message arrived without warning and appeared on every screen across human civilization at the same moment. From the crowded cities of Earth to the mining stations floating in the asteroid belt beyond Mars, from the research facilities buried beneath Europa's ice to the colonial settlements on Luna and the red deserts of Mars, everywhere humans lived and worked suddenly received the same transmission, and it came in a language that no human had programmed into their systems yet somehow. Every computer and device could read it perfectly. Ambassador Helen Carter stood in the United Earth Assembly Hall deep beneath the Swiss mountains and read the words aloud to the gathered representatives, her hands trembling slightly as she held the data pad because the message was unlike anything humanity had ever received before, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone in that massive underground chamber. The Galactic Council of Sovereign Species hereby commands humanity to provide annual tribute as befits your status as a newly recognized sentient species, and this tribute will consist of 20% of all refined metals produced by your civilization, 15% of biological specimens for Council research purposes, and 10,000 individuals selected by Council representatives for labor assignments in designated sectors across Council territory, and this decree is effective immediately. With full compliance expected within 30 standard days, the chamber fell into absolute silence as Helen finished reading, and for several long seconds, nobody moved or spoke because they were all processing what they had just heard. What the Council was actually demanding from them, and Captain Daniel Hayes listened from his command chair aboard the defense frigate Liberty, orbiting somewhere between Earth and Mars, and his jaw clenched tight as the words sank in. His first officer, Lieutenant Karen Wells, stood beside him and spoke the thought that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud because saying it made it real and undeniable. They want slaves, and that is exactly what they are demanding from us. The Galactic Council had made first contact with humanity only 3 years earlier, and it had seemed almost friendly at the time. They had appeared in massive ships that dwarfed anything humans had built, and their representatives had been polite, if somewhat condescending, as they explained that humanity was young and barely qualified to be called a spacefaring species, and there were rules that governed civilized species and protocols that must be followed, and above all there was respect that must be shown to the elder races, who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years, before humans had even discovered fire. Commander Richard Stone paced back and forth in his operations center buried deep beneath the Colorado mountains and around him. Holographic displays showed the position of every human military vessel in the solar system, and it was not an impressive sight compared to what intelligence reports suggested the Council possessed in their fleet. Lieutenant Paul Grant looked up from his station and delivered the news that everyone had been dreading since the message arrived. The transmission came from a Council enforcement fleet holding position just outside our solar system, and sir, they have 300 ships, and each one is the size of a small city. Richard stopped pacing and stared at the tactical display, because 300 ships was more than humanity could possibly fight, and the numbers told a story that nobody wanted to hear. Humanity had 42 military vessels that could be called warships in any serious sense, and maybe another 100 civilian ships that had been fitted with weapons, but calling them combat-capable was generous at best. "What is their timeline, Paul?" Richard asked quietly. "They have given us 30 Earth days to comply with the tribute demand. And after that, they say they will begin what they call corrective measures." Paul replied, and his voice carried the weight of what corrective measures likely meant. Back in Geneva, the assembly had erupted into shouting chaos with representatives talking over each other, and some demanding that humanity comply immediately because fighting was suicide, while others called for defiance despite the impossible odds, and still others tried to find some middle ground that probably did not exist. And Helen watched them all, while her mind raced through calculations that had no good answers. The Council represented 17 different spacefaring civilizations, and some of those species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, and they had technology that seemed like magic to human eyes and weapons that intelligent suggested could crack planets open like eggs. And they had an arrogance born from 10,000 years of never being challenged by anyone. Helen's communicator buzzed with a priority message from President Andrew Collins. himself, and his voice was grave and tired because he had not slept since the message arrived 12 hours ago. Ambassador Carter, I need you to coordinate with the Defense Council because we are calling an emergency session with every department head and every military commander and every colonial governor, and we have a decision to make that will define what humanity becomes. What kind of decision are we talking about, Mr. President? Helen asked carefully, even though she already knew the answer. The kind that defines whether we become a species that bows or one that stands. Andrew replied after a long pause. Across human space, the debate raged without pause, and on Luna, Governor Patricia Morris argued for negotiation and buying time while on Mars. Administrator Jack Bennett called for armed resistance despite the odds, and on Europa Station scientists, led by Dr. Lisa Chang, ran calculations and simulations, trying to find any scenario where humanity survived, and none of the numbers looked good no matter how many times they ran the models. Captain Daniel Hayes sat in his command chair and stared out at the stars through the main view screen, and somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, 300 alien warships waited with weapons and technology that humanity could barely understand, and they wanted humanity to kneel and submit, become servants to species that considered themselves superior simply because they were older. Karen spoke quietly from beside him and asked the question that mattered most. Sir, what do you think we should do? Daniel did not answer immediately because this was not a question that deserved a quick response, and he thought about his daughter, Emma, who is 7 years old and wanted to be a starship captain when she grew up, and he thought about the colonies that humans had built with their own sweat and ingenuity. He thought about every human who had ever looked up at the stars and dared to dream of reaching them. I think that humanity did not claw its way out of caves and across the solar system just to become someone else's servant, Daniel said finally. Karen nodded slowly because she had been thinking the same thing, and that is what I think too. The emergency session convened in a secure virtual space with representatives from every corner of human civilization appearing as holographic avatars, and President Andrew Collins stood at the center with his face lined and aged by the weight of what they were about to decide. Let us be clear about what we are facing, Andrew began, and his voice carried to every representative in the virtual space. The Council can destroy us, and our military analysts give us less than a 5% chance of victory in any kind of open conflict, but they have also made very clear what they are asking for, and it is submission, and it is slavery, and it is the end of human sovereignty. Representative Frank Murphy from the Europa delegation spoke up and argued that humanity should negotiate and buy time and build up defenses, and maybe in 50 years humanity would be ready to resist. But Commander Richard Stone cut him off. They will never let us build up because that is the entire point of the tribute system, Richard said flatly. They keep you weak, and they keep you dependent, and they keep you under control always. So what is the alternative? Someone shouted from the back of the virtual assembly. Suicide. The alternative is to make them understand that enslaving humanity costs more than it is worth. Richard replied, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. The chamber fell silent because everyone understood what he was suggesting. You were talking about war, Frank said quietly. I am talking about survival, Richard replied. On our terms, President Andrew Collins looked around at the assembled representatives and at the holographic faces of humanity's leaders, and this was the moment that would echo across generations and define what humanity would become, and he knew that whatever decision they made right now would be remembered forever. We need a response to the Council's demand, Andrew said slowly and carefully. Something that makes our position absolutely clear, and Ambassador Carter, you will be delivering it, so what should we tell them? Helen Carter thought about her own children, safe in Geneva's protected zones, and she thought about humanity's brief but fierce history, and about all the tyrants and empires that had tried to subjugate others throughout human civilization, and about all the people who had refused to bow, no matter the cost. I know what we should say, Helen said quietly, and every eye in the virtual chamber turned to her. What word, Ambassador? Helen met his eyes and spoke clearly, so that everyone could hear, and everyone could understand, and everyone would know what humanity had chosen. No, she said, and that single word hung in the air like a declaration of war. The response went out on every channel that humanity could access, and it was broadcast across all frequencies and sent directly to the Assault Council's enforcement fleet holding position at the edge of the solar system, and it was translated into every known language and transmitted with such clarity that there could be no misunderstanding about what humanity had decided. One word that would change everything, though. The single-word response traveled across space at the speed of light and reached the Council enforcement fleet in less than 6 hours, and in the command chamber of the flagship's Supreme Commander, Zarkeith stared at the translated message with what might have been confusion on his crystalline features, because in 300 cycles of service he had never seen anything like this before. "This must be an error in the translation system," Zarkeith said to his assembled officers, "and run it through the algorithm again. Because surely the humans did not just refuse our demand." Sub-Commander Velk worked the holographic controls and ran the message through the translation matrix again, and then a third time, just to be certain, but the result remained exactly the same every single time. "They refuse?" Velk asked, and his vocal membranes vibrated with genuine disbelief. "The humans actually refuse," Zarkeith had been enforcing. "Council decrees for 300 cycles, and during all that time across dozens of newly contacted species, not one had ever simply refused the tribute demand outright, and some had negotiated for better terms, and some had asked for more time, and some had even mounted token resistance before inevitably surrendering, but none had simply said no, as if refusing the Council were the simplest thing in the world. "Check their military deployments," Zarkeith ordered, and his tone carried an edge of concern now. "Perhaps they have acquired weapons we are unaware of. Or perhaps they have formed an alliance with another power." The tactical officers worked frantically, and their sensors could count individual ships from light years away, and the results came back quickly and painted a picture that made no logical sense. "Their fleet is concentrating, Supreme Commander," the tactical officer reported. 42 military vessels and approximately 130 armed civilian craft, and they are forming a defensive perimeter around their primary world. Zarkeith felt something close to amusement, because less than 200 ships against his 300 warships was not a battle. It was a massacre waiting to happen, and each of his vessels could atomize an entire fleet of primitive human ships. "They are insane," Velk observed flatly. "They are ignorant," Zarkeith corrected, because clearly the humans did not understand the gulf between their technology and Council capabilities. "We will give them a demonstration and target their outer colony on the icy moon with the research station and destroy it completely and show them what defiance costs." Back in Geneva, the Defense Council monitored every movement of the Council fleet with growing tension, and when the flagship began moving toward Europa Station with 2 escort vessels, alarm klaxons blared across every human installation in the solar system. "They are targeting Europa," Lieutenant Paul Grant reported to Commander Richard Stone, and his voice was tight with controlled fear. 3 ships breaking formation and heading in system at high speed. "Evacuate the station immediately," Richard ordered. "Without hesitation, get everyone out right now and leave everything behind." On Europa Station, Dr. Lisa Chang coordinated the evacuation while klaxons wailed through every corridor, and over 3,000 scientists and support staff and families scrambled desperately for the transport ships docked at the stations. Ports and parents carried crying children and people, abandoned decades of research, and nobody looked back, because staying meant death. "We need more time," Operations Chief Greg Turner shouted over the chaos as panicked crowds pushed through the narrow corridors. "We do not have more time," Lisa replied, while pulling up the tactical display, and the Council ships were burning hard toward them, and their fusion drives were visible from Europa's surface as brilliant points of light growing larger. "Get the children loaded first, and leave everything else behind." Captain Daniel Hayes watched from the Liberty as the Council ships approached Europa, and his orders were crystal clear from command. "Do not engage and do not reveal the hidden defenses, because the plan required patience and timing and nerves of steel." "They are going to kill everyone on that station," Karen Wells said, and her voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "Not if the evacuation completes in time." Daniel replied, though his hands gripped the armrests of his command chair hard enough that his knuckles turned white. The last transport cleared Europa Station with less than 3 minutes to spare, and the three Council ships reached firing range, and without any warning or communication or mercy, they unleashed their weapons on the defenseless research facility. The destruction was spectacular and terrible to watch because particle beams carved through Europa Station's structure like hot knives through butter, and secondary explosions blossomed across the facility as reactor containment. And in less than 30 seconds, humanity's premier research outpost was reduced to expanding clouds of debris and vaporized metal. The Council ships held their position as if waiting to see the effect of their demonstration, and they did not have to wait long for humanity's response. "This is Commander Richard Stone of United Earth Defense to all human vessels," Richard's voice echoed across every military channel in the solar system. "Operation Defiance is now active, and all units execute your assigned roles and show them what it costs to threaten humanity." What happened next would later be called the Battle of the Inner System, though historians would debate forever whether it was truly a battle or something closer to an ambush or a trap. The Council had made 3 critical miscalculations that would cost them dearly, and the first mistake was assuming that human weapons technology was as primitive as human ship design, but they were wrong because what? Humanity lacked in advanced propulsion and energy generation they had compensated for with sheer ingenuity in weaponry. The second mistake was assuming humans would fight conventionally in neat formations, ship against ship and fleet against fleet, but they were wrong again because humanity had no intention of playing by rules designed by species who had already won. The third and most fatal mistake was assuming that the small human fleet represented the totality of humanity's defensive capability, and this was the biggest error of all. As the 3 Council ships finished destroying Europa Station, they suddenly found themselves targeted by defense platforms that had not existed on their sensors moments before, and hidden among the asteroids of the belt, and disguised as mining equipment and camouflaged against the background radiation of Jupiter. Hundreds of automated weapons platforms came online simultaneously. All of them had been waiting in complete silence for exactly this moment. The first Council ship died before its commander could even process what was happening because a kinetic impactor moving at 40% of light speed punched through its shields as if they were made of paper, and the impact released energy equivalent to multiple nuclear weapons, and the ship came apart like a glass sculpture struck by a hammer. The second ship managed to raise its defenses and began evasive maneuvers, but human weapons did not rely on a single attack vector, and missile swarms bracketed the vessel from 6 different angles, while laser platforms burned through its ablative armor methodically, and when its power core was finally breached, the explosion was visible from Earth as a brief new star. The third ship turned to flee, and its commander finally recognized the trap they had flown into, but it was already too late because the ship made it almost to the edge of Jupiter's gravity, well before a spread of fusion torpedoes caught it from behind, and each warhead carried yields measured in gigatons, and the UCHS and the Council ship's shields held for nearly 10 seconds before collapsing completely, and the vessel disappeared in a miniature sun that burned for almost a full minute. In the flagship, Supreme Commander Zarketh watched in stunned absolute silence as 3 of his warships simply ceased to exist in the span of less than 2 minutes. "Status report immediately," Zarketh demanded, and his voice carried an edge that his crew had never heard before. "All 3 vessels destroyed with no survivors," Velk reported, and his voice was shaking badly. "The humans had weapons platforms hidden throughout their inner system, and Supreme Commander, our sensors never detected them at all." "That is impossible," Zarketh said flatly. "Our sensor technology is centuries beyond anything they possess." "They were not using active systems," the sensor officer explained quickly. "They were completely dormant and powered down and electromagnetically shielded, and they only activated at the precise moment of attack." Zarketh felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine, and he had felt this sensation only once before during his youth, when his ship had nearly been caught in a stellar collapse. And it took him a moment to identify the feeling because it had been so long. "Fear. Pull back immediately," Zarketh ordered, and his voice was steady despite the emotion. "Reform the fleet at the heliopause and send a message to the Council and tell them the humans are far more dangerous than initial assessments indicated. As the Council fleet withdrew to regroup, spontaneous celebrations erupted across human space and on Earth. Crowds gathered in streets and squares and cheered the impossible victory, and on Mars colonists raise D-glasses in salute to the crews who had manned the hidden platforms and on Luna. Children watched replays of the battle with wide eyes full of wonder and pride. But in the command centers, the military leadership understood the reality of their situation much better than the celebrating civilians. "We bloodied their nose," Admiral Susan Cross said grimly as she reviewed the tactical data with Commander Richard Stone. "But we lost 3 of our hidden platforms in the process, and now they know about the others and they will be ready next time. And we lost Europa Station," Richard added quietly. 3,000 people homeless and decades of research gone forever, but we proved something important. President Andrew Collins interjected via holographic link. "We proved that humanity will not be pushed around and that we will fight back." "That we will die, you mean?" Susan corrected bluntly. "Sir, we got lucky today because they sent 3 ships to make an example, and next time they will send 30 ships, or maybe all 300, and we do not have enough hidden platforms to stop a full fleet assault? Then we better make sure we do not need to stop them all," Andrew said slowly. "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "I mean that we need to make them afraid," Andrew explained. "Not afraid of our weapons, but afraid of us, and afraid of what fighting humanity actually costs." Kevin Ross had never expected his late-night project to be reviewed by anyone important, and certainly not by the entire United Earth Strategic Command. But now, the 24-year-old graduate student sat nervously in the MIT conference room, while holographic avatars of humanity's military leadership materialized around the table one by one. "Mr. Ross, your proposal is either brilliant or completely insane," Commander Richard Stone began without any preamble. "And we are still debating which category it falls into. Probably both, sir," Kevin admitted, and tried to keep his hands from shaking. "That is kind of the entire point of the plan." Admiral Susan Cross leaned forward and her holographic form flickered slightly with the transmission lag. "And explain it again in simple terms and assume we are all sleep-deprived and running on coffee, because we are." Kevin pulled up his presentation with trembling hands and began to explain. The idea that had come to him during a sleepless night after Europa Station was destroyed. "The Council fleet operates on predictable patterns, right?" Kevin said, and gained confidence as he spoke. "They have been doing this for thousands of years, and jump in system and make demands and use its overwhelming force if needed, and it has worked every single time because their technology and numbers have always been superior to whoever they are fighting." "Go on," Richard prompted, "but superior technology creates dependencies," Kevin continued and pulled up charts and diagrams. "The more advanced your systems become, the more they rely on specific conditions, and the Council ships use quantum-linked communication arrays and antimatter reactors and gravitic shielding, and all of these require precise calibration and specific environmental parameters to function properly." "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Susan asked. Kevin took a deep breath before answering, because this was the part that sounded completely insane. "What if we change those parameters?" Kevin said simply. "What if we make the environment hostile to their technology and poison the well, so to speak?" "You mean like an electromagnetic pulse?" Lieutenant Paul Grant asked from his position near the back. "Not exactly," Kevin replied and shook his head. "More like corrupting their navigation and communication systems from within in the Council ships. Navigate using subspace beacons, right? And they map the stellar neighborhood using quantum entanglement markers. And what if we corrupted those markers and made their navigation systems give them false readings?" The room fell into complete silence, while everyone processed what Kevin was suggesting. "That is actually feasible," Admiral Cross said slowly, and her tactical mind was already working through the implications. "We have been mapping their subspace markers for months now, and if we could inject false data into their network, then their entire fleet would be flying blind. Or worse, they would be flying into traps while thinking they are in safe positions." Richard finished the thought. "How do we corrupt quantum markers?" President Andrew Collins asked, because he had been listening silently until now. "That technology is far beyond our current capabilities. We do not need to understand how it works," Kevin explained with growing confidence. We just need to introduce chaos into the system, and I have been working with Dr. Claire Morgan at the Quantum Research Lab, and we think we can generate interference. Patterns that scramble entanglement, coherence across multiple light years. What is the catch? Susan asked flatly. Because there is always a catch with plans this clever. Kevin grimaced before answering, because he knew. This was the part they would not like. It would blind us to, Kevin admitted, any quantum communication. Or navigation would become impossible for everyone, and we would be back to using radio and optical telescopes exclusively. But we are already using those systems, Richard pointed out, and a slight smile crossed his face. We never developed quantum technology in the first place, so we would essentially be bringing them down to our level. Exactly, Kevin said and felt relief wash over him. We leveled the playing field completely. President Collins exchanged glances, his advisors through their holographic connections, and made a decision that would change everything. How long to implement this system? Collins asked. If we started right now, then maybe 5 days, Kevin replied. Possibly 6. If we encounter unexpected problems. We have 10 days until their ultimatum expires. Andrew noted, and they are bringing reinforcements, which means 600 ships instead of 300. Do it, Mr. Ross. And if this works, you have a job anywhere in the government you want. Can I just go back to grad school? Kevin asked weakly. Not a chance, Susan said, but she was almost smiling now, while Kevin and Dr. Claire Morgan worked frantically on the quantum interference project. Other preparations were underway across all of human space in a coordinated effort, unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. On Mars, Administrator Jack Bennett coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel from surface colonies because if the Council decided to bombard population centers, then having fewer targets would save countless lives. On Luna, Governor Patricia Morris oversaw the construction of hardened bunkers deep beneath the lunar surface in ancient lava. Tubes were being converted into shelters that could house millions of people if the worst happened. And in Earth's orbit, something unprecedented was taking shape that would become either humanity's greatest defensive achievement or its most spectacular failure. Captain Daniel Hayes watched from the Liberty as construction crews worked around the clock on what was officially called the Unity platform, but which everyone was already calling by a different name. It is the biggest thing we have ever built, Lieutenant Karen Wells observed as they watched work crews swarm over the massive structure like ants on a hill, and probably the craziest idea anyone has ever had. The Gauntlet, as everyone called it, was essentially a corridor in space stretching 2 light seconds long and defined by thousands of weapons platforms and power generators and sensor arrays and other systems, whose purposes only the designers fully understood and any ship passing through that corridor would face concentrated fire from multiple angles with absolutely no room to maneuver. Do you think it will work? Karen asked quietly. It will work once, Daniel replied, and his voice carried certainty. Maybe twice if we are very lucky, but after that they will find a way around it or through it, but that is okay because we do not need to win every battle. We just need to win enough of them to make conquest too expensive. His communicator chimed with an incoming priority message, and it was Commander Stone with new orders. Captain Hayes, I am reassigning the Liberty to Task Force Prometheus, Stone said without preamble. Report to Mars orbit immediately for full briefing. Sir, what exactly is Task Force Prometheus? Daniel asked. Something we probably should have organized 3 years ago when the Council first made contact, Stone replied, and then the connection ended. Task Force Prometheus turned out to be humanity's insurance policy, and when Daniel arrived at Mars orbit for the briefing, he found himself in a room with 11 other ship captains, and Admiral Susan Cross stood at the front with an expression that Daniel had never seen on her face before. 12 ships, Susan began without any pleasantries, each packed with humanity's accumulated knowledge and genetic samples and cultural archives and embryonic colonization equipment, and if Earth falls and if the Council destroys our home system, then you will scatter 2 pre-selected star systems and ensure humanity's survival somewhere in the galaxy. We are the backup plan, Captain Linda Shaw of the Endeavour said slowly as the reality sank in. The part nobody tells the public about because it would cause mass panic. Exactly, Susan confirmed. If I give the order, then you jump immediately too. You're assigned coordinates, and you do not look back and know. Heroics and no second chances, and you run, and you survive, and you rebuild humanity somewhere else. Captain Linda Shaw raised her hand like a student in class and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "And if we refuse the order, Admiral," Linda asked quietly, "then you will die with everyone else, and humanity's story ends forever," Susan replied with brutal honesty. "I need to know right now if you can follow that order when it comes, and I need complete honest." "Why?" "Because there is no room for hesitation." One by one, around the room, the 12 captains nodded their acceptance, and it was the hardest promise that any of them had ever made, because it meant abandoning everyone they knew if the worst happened. While Task Force Prometheus prepared for a future that hopefully would never come, the Council's reinforcements arrived at the heliopause in a display of power meant to intimidate. Supreme Commander Zarkith watched as 300 additional warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and doubled his fleet strength to 600 vessels, and with them came Council Arbiter Thalnex, who was a member of the governing council itself. Thalnex belonged to the ancients who had founded the council 10,000 years ago. His species had evolved beyond physical form and existed as patterns of organized energy maintained by sophisticated containment fields, and he manifested on the flagship's command deck as a vaguely humanoid shimmer of light. "Supreme Commander, I have reviewed your report on the human resistance." Thalnex's voice resonated directly in the minds of everyone present. "And this situation is completely unprecedented in Council history." "Yes, Arbiter," Zarkith replied carefully. "The humans are proving more formidable than initial assessments indicated." "Formidable?" Thalnex repeated, and there might have been amusement in his mental voice. "They destroyed 3 of your ships with primitive kinetic weapons and hidden platforms, and that is not formidable, Commander. That is embarrassing for the Council." Zarkith felt his crystalline structure flush with heat at the rebuke. "The humans employed asymmetric tactics, Arbiter," Zarkith said defensively. "They did not fight as we expected them to fight. Tactics that any species with minimal strategic thought might employ," Thalnex interrupted, "and yet you were surprised, and I want to know why." "Because no species has dared employ such tactics against the Council in living memory," Zarkith admitted. "Precisely," Thalnex said, and his energy pattern shifted. "We have become complacent, and the humans have reminded us that even primitives can be dangerous if sufficiently motivated, and I am here to ensure this matter is resolved definitively." "What are your orders, Arbiter?" Zarkith asked. "We will jump the entire fleet into the human home system," Thalnex declared. "Not to the outer reaches, but directly to their primary world, and 600 warships appearing in Earth orbit simultaneously. And we will give them one final opportunity to surrender, and if they refuse, we will systematically destroy their cities, until they comply or until nothing remains." 3 days before the Council's deadline, Kevin Ross and Dr. Claire Morgan activated the quantum interference field from a secure facility deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, and neither of them was entirely certain what would happen when they pressed the final activation sequence. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular beyond anything they had imagined, because across human space, every quantum communication relay stuttered and died in the same moment, and navigation beacons that had guided Council ships for millennia suddenly transmitted nothing but gibberish, and the carefully maintained network of entangled particles that made faster-than-light coordination possible dissolved into quantum chaos. "It is working," Claire breathed, while watching the cascade propagate through the system faster than light itself. "The interference wave is spreading exactly as predicted, and it will reach the Council fleet at the heliopause in approximately 6 hours." Kevin was already pulling up the next set of calculations, because the hard part was keeping the interference field stable. "And now we just have to hope they are as dependent on quantum navigation as we think they are." In the Council flagship, alarms began sounding at precisely 0642 Earth Standard Time, and every officer on the command deck looked up, simultaneously as warning lights flashed across their stations. "Supreme Commander," the navigation officer called out, and his voice carried an edge of panic that Zarkith had never heard before. "The quantum beacon network is failing, and all of them simultaneously across the entire sector." Zarketh was at the officer's station in 3 long strides and defined failing immediately. "They are still transmitting, sir, but the data is completely corrupted." The officer explained frantically, "The entanglement coherence has collapsed across the entire sector. And it is like someone introduced massive quantum uncertainty into the network itself." "Humans," Arbiter Thalnex said, and his energy form pulsed with what might have been surprise or admiration. "They could not develop quantum technology themselves, so they destroyed it instead and brought us down to their level. Can we compensate?" Varketh demanded. "We can navigate using conventional sensors," the officer replied. "But it will be significantly slower and less precise, and Supreme Commander, our fleet coordination will be severely degraded, because we rely on quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication across the entire fleet." Thalnex flickered with apparent amusement at humanity's audacity, "And they have blinded us, or rather, they've reduced us to their technological level, and I must admit that is remarkably clever." "It changes nothing," Zarketh insisted, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "We still have 600 ships, and they still have barely 200, and the outcome remains inevitable." "Perhaps," Thalnex said slowly. "Proceed with the jump to Earth, but Commander, I strongly suggest you expect the unexpected, because these humans seem to specialize in surprises." On Earth, in the Orbital Defense Command Center, Commander Richard Stone watched the countdown with grim satisfaction, while around him, officers monitored every system humanity had deployed. "The quantum interference is holding stable," Lieutenant Paul Grant reported. "The Council fleet is moving, but their coordination is clearly degraded, and ships are having to maintain visual contact with each other instead of using their quantum network." "Good," Richard said, and pulled up the tactical display that is going to make them cluster together for the jump, which is exactly what we want. "And Admiral Cross, is the gauntlet ready?" Susan Cross's hologram nodded from her position aboard the command. "Ship and all weapons platforms are online and fully charged, and the corridor is as prepared as it will ever be." "And Task Force Prometheus?" Richard asked. "Standing by at designated rally points?" Susan replied, "If this goes badly, they will scatter on my command and ensure humanity survives somewhere. It will not go badly," Richard said with more confidence than he actually felt. "We have planned for every variable we could think of." "We have planned for every variable we could imagine," Susan corrected. "But we are fighting species that have been doing this for thousands of years, and they have seen situations we cannot even conceive of yet." "Then it is fortunate," Richard replied, "that we have some surprises they cannot conceive of either." The Council fleet jumped into Earth's solar system with coordinated precision despite the quantum interference, and 600 warships materialized in a massive formation between Mars and Earth, with their hulls gleaming in the sunlight like a swarm of metal locusts. It was the largest concentration of military power that human eyes had ever witnessed, and it was there for one purpose only, which was to make humanity kneel or die. "All human vessels," Arbiter Thalnex's mental voice broadcast across every frequency, "this is your final opportunity for peaceful surrender, and lower your shields and power down your weapons, and prepare to be boarded, and any resistance will be met with immediate and total annihilation." The response came not from President Collins or Admiral Cross, but from an unexpected source that caught everyone by surprise. "Council fleet, this is Captain Daniel Hayes of the frigate Liberty." Daniel's voice was calm and steady. "On behalf of humanity, I have a message for you." In the Council flagship, Supreme Commander Zarketh pulled up the scan data on the Liberty, and it was a small vessel that barely qualified as a warship and was holding position near Earth orbit. "Another defiant speech," Zarketh muttered to himself. But Daniel Hayes did not make a speech or deliver threats or issue demands. "Message delivered," Daniel said simply. And then everything changed in an instant as hell erupted across the solar system, the weapons platforms hidden throughout the inner system fired simultaneously, but they did not fire at the Council ships as everyone expected. They fired at empty space itself in a carefully choreographed pattern that Kevin Ross had spent weeks calculating. Hundreds of nuclear-pumped lasers, each tuned to incredibly specific frequencies, lanced out in a geometric pattern, and the beams intersected in the space surrounding the entire Council fleet and created a web of energy that suddenly collapsed inward on itself. "What are they doing?" Zarketh began, but stopped as his sensors registered something impossible. The humans had just detonated a spatial distortion field around the entire Council fleet using nothing but precisely tuned energy beams and mathematics. Space-time itself began warping and twisting and folding in on itself in ways that violated every natural law, and the effect was temporary and would last only seconds. But those seconds were enough to achieve exactly what humanity needed. Every Council ship suddenly found itself being pulled toward its neighbors as gravitational constants fluctuated wildly, and inertial dampeners screamed as they tried to compensate for physics that had stopped making sense. Ships collided, and while not many, because the Council crews were too skilled for mass collisions, it was enough to cause complete chaos and more. Critically, the fleet's careful formation dissolved into disorder as each vessel flew desperately to maintain position in space that was actively fighting back against them. "Tactical retreat immediately," Zarketh ordered, and his voice carried urgency now. All ships emergency jumped to secondary coordinates, but the quantum beacons were still corrupted and spewing gibberish, and the navigational reference points needed for a safe, faster-than-light jump were completely unreliable, and jumping blind could scatter the fleet across light years, or worse, drop ships inside stars, or directly into planets. They were trapped in normal space, and that was when the real attack began, with devastating coordination. All ships. Admiral Susan Cross's voice cut across every human channel. "Weapons free and execute Operation Hornet's Nest immediately." The human fleet abandoned their defensive positions and charged directly at the Council formation, with every weapon firing, and it was suicide, and it was insane, and it was exactly the kind of move that no rational military force would ever attempt, which was precisely why the Council was completely unprepared for it. "They are attacking." Subcommander Velk asked in absolute disbelief. 200 ships against 600 in a direct assault, but the humans were not attacking conventionally. And instead of focusing fire to destroy ships one by one, they were firing everything at maximum dispersion to create chaos. Thousands of missiles swarmed the Council formation, and they were not even guided weapons, just dumb rockets with nuclear warheads, spreading out in a massive cloud, and the Council's point defense systems engaged frantically and destroyed hundreds of missiles, but there were thousands more coming in waves. And behind the missiles came something far worse. "They are firing kinetic impactors," the tactical officer reported with rising alarm. "Thousands of them in all shapes and sizes, and steel rods and ice chunks and even processed garbage, and they are just throwing mass at us at relativistic speeds. At slower speeds, the impacts would have been merely annoying, but these projectiles were moving at significant fractions of light speed. And there were so many that the Council's targeting systems could not possibly track them all simultaneously. Ships began taking hits, and nothing was fatal or ship-destroying, but enough to damage sensors and disrupt shields and force vessels to maneuver defensively and break formation even further. And all the while, the spatial distortion field kept pulsing, in waves making any kind of coordinated response nearly impossible. "This is complete chaos," Zarketh roared in frustration. "They are not even trying to destroy us, they are just creating maximum disorder." "That is precisely the point, Commander," Arbiter Thalnex replied, and his energy form was flickering with something that looked disturbingly like concern. "They cannot defeat us in conventional combat, so they are not fighting conventionally, and they are making it. It's impossible for us to fight conventionally either." A proximity alarm shrieked across the flagship, and 3 human frigates were on a direct collision course, burning their engines at absolute maximum thrust. "They are going to ram us," Velk shouted. "Destroy them immediately," Zarketh ordered. The flagships' main batteries engaged and poured devastating fire into the approaching human ships, and 2 were destroyed almost instantly and blown apart by weapons that could crack moons like eggs. The 3rd ship, the Liberty, survived just barely long enough to matter. Captain Daniel Hayes watched his ship die around him as Council fire tore through the Liberty's hull like paper, and explosions ripped through the engineering section, and the Bridge was venting atmosphere into space, and Karen Wells was slumped over her console with blood floating in the zero gravity. "Eject the pods," Daniel ordered, and his voice was barely audible over the screaming alarms. "Everyone out right now, and that is a direct order." "What about you, sir?" Lieutenant Marcus Grant asked while struggling with his damaged harness. "Someone has." "To keep her on course," Daniel replied simply, and he pulled up the navigation overlay and locked the Liberty's trajectory directly toward the Council flagship and tied down the throttle at maximum. "Go now and tell my daughter I love her, and tell her I died free." The crew evacuated in a stream of emergency pods while Daniel stayed at his helm and watched the Council flagship grow larger and larger in the view screen until it filled his entire view. The Liberty hit the Council flagship at a significant fraction of light speed with an impact that registered on every sensor in the solar system. The impact punched a hole 300 meters wide through the Council flagship's primary hull, and atmosphere erupted from the wound in a massive plume, while debris scattered across space like shrapnel and secondary explosions rippled through the massive vessel as critical systems failed and cascaded throughout multiple decks. The standoff that followed lasted 6 days, with neither side willing to make the next move, and the Council fleet held position near Mars, making repairs and presumably debating their options, while the human fleet maintained defensive positions around Earth, watching and waiting. On the 7th day, a single Council ship requested permission to approach Earth and broadcast on diplomatic channels, asking for a meeting with human leadership. It is a trick. General Christopher Allen insisted during the emergency command meeting. "They want to get our leaders in one place and eliminate them all at once." "Maybe," Commander Richard Stone replied while studying the transmission data. "Maybe they actually want to talk because we hurt them badly enough to reconsider." President Andrew Collins listened to the debate and then made his decision with the same certainty he had shown when humanity first said no. "I will meet with them," Andrew announced, "on the Unity platform with full security protocols. And if they want to talk, then we talk. And if it is a trap, then we face it, because we have faced worse." The meeting was set for noon, Earth Standard Time, on the platform that everyone still called the Gauntlet, and President Collins arrived with a security detail and advisors, including Commander Stone and Ambassador Helen Carter. The Council delegation arrived in a shuttle and consisted of Supreme Commander Zarketh and Subcommander Velk and Arbiter Thalnex, whose energy form was contained in a portable field generator. The two groups faced each other across a conference table, and for a long moment, nobody spoke while humans and aliens sized each other up. "President Collins, I must begin with an admission." Arbiter Thalnex's voice resonated in everyone's minds. "The Council made a fundamental error in how we approached humanity." Andrew said nothing and simply waited for Thalnex to continue. "We treated you as we have treated every newly contacted species for 10,000 years. Thalnex continued, "We assumed that superior technology and overwhelming force would lead inevitably to compliance, and we assumed you would think as others have thought, and act as others have acted." "You assumed we would surrender," Andrew said flatly. "Yes," Thalnex replied without hesitation. "It is what every other species has done throughout recorded history, and some negotiate for better terms and some resist briefly, but all eventually recognize that Council authority is inevitable, and submission is the only logical choice." "And we did not submit," Helen Carter added. "You did not even consider it."
Akas.
Zarketh interjected, and his crystalline features still bore visible damage from the Liberty's impact. "You simply said no, as if refusing the Council were as simple as declining an invitation." "Because it is that simple," Andrew replied. "You asked us to give up our freedom, and we said no, and that is not complicated. It is unprecedented," Thalnex said, and there was clear respect in his mental voice now. "In 10,000 years of Council history, no species has defied tribute demands. As you did, and your tactics were chaotic and inefficient, and by all military doctrine completely suicidal. But they worked," Richard Stone pointed out. "They worked remarkably well." Thalnex agreed. "You forced us to fight on your terms in conditions that negated our technological advantages, and you turned our own systems against us, and most importantly, you made it absolutely clear that subjugating humanity would cost more than the Council has paid in living memory. So you are here to negotiate our surrender terms? Andrew asked. No, Thalnex replied, and his energy form pulsed with what might have been excitement. We are here to propose something the Council has not done in 5,000 years, which is to make an exception to our standard procedures. The human delegation exchanged glances of surprise. Explain that, Andrew said carefully. The Council was founded on a simple principle that order must be maintained across the galaxy. Thalnex began. Chaos and conflict between species and unregulated expansion lead to suffering on scales you cannot imagine, and the tribute system exists. To ensure younger species develop in harmony with established civilizations. Harmony, Helen repeated, and her voice was sharp. You mean subjugation and control? Sometimes yes, Thalnex admitted with surprising honesty. The system is imperfect, and it was designed millennia ago for a different galaxy, and changing it has always seemed impossible because Council members who benefit have no incentive to reform in younger species. Who might push for change lack the power to force it. Until now, Richard said as understanding dawned. Until now, Thalnex confirmed. Humanity has done something remarkable, and you have proven that. Council authority is not absolute, and that our military might can be challenged in every species in the galaxy watched you refuse, and watched you fight, and watched you make the Council bleed, and that changes everything. Supreme Commander Zarkith shifted uncomfortably before speaking, and this arbiter is correct, because in the weeks since our battle, we have received communications from 17 Council member species, and some demand we annihilate Earth as an example. But others are quietly asking questions about the tribute system and about whether things could be different. You were saying we started something, Andrew said. You started a conversation that was long overdue, Thalnex replied. But conversations alone do not change systems, and what we need now is a new model for how species interact with the Council. And you want humanity to be that model? Helen asked, with clear skepticism. We are proposing that humanity be granted autonomous status, Thalnex said carefully. No tribute and no Council oversight and full sovereignty over your territory and development. And in exchange, you agree to basic principles like no aggressive expansion and cooperation on security concerns and adherence to fundamental laws regarding other sentient species. That is it? Richard asked. No catch and no hidden requirements. The catch, Zarkith said bluntly, is that you would be unique and the only species with full autonomy, despite not being a Council member, and every other younger species will look at you and ask why them and not us. Which forces the Council to reform, Andrew said as he saw the implications. Either extend the same terms to others, or justify why humanity is special. Exactly, Thalnex confirmed. You would be effectively a living challenge to Council authority, and your existence would prove that alternatives are possible. Why? Andrew finally asked. Why are you willing to do this when you could still destroy us? We could reduce Earth to rubble, Thalnex agreed. But it would cost us more than ships and resources because it would cost us legitimacy, and if the Council is seen as an empire that destroys anyone who questions authority, then we become tyrants, and tyranny eventually always falls. You are afraid, Helen said with wonder in her voice. Not of our military, but of what we represent. We are pragmatic, Thalnex corrected. Humanity proved Council authority can be challenged, and better to accommodate that challenge than fight a war. That might spread to other species, and better to have humanity as a difficult ally than a martyred enemy. The negotiations continued for hours, with both sides, working through details and compromises until they had an agreement that would fundamentally change humanity's relationship with the galaxy. Earth would retain full sovereignty with no tribute, and no forced integration, and in exchange humanity would agree to peaceful development and cooperation on security, and eventually participation in Council initiatives as equals. This is not perfect, Ambassador Helen Carter said as they reviewed the final document. There will be problems and conflicts ahead. Nothing involving different species is ever perfect. Thalnex agreed, but it is better than the alternative for both of us. President Andrew Collins signed the agreement with an old-fashioned pen, and the document would be stored in archives on both Earth and the Council's central repository as a symbol of change. As the Council delegation prepared to leave, Arbiter Thalnex paused and asked one final question. "President Collins, when we first demanded tribute and showed you our fleet, were you afraid?" Thalnex asked. "Terrified," Andrew admitted honestly. "Anyone with sense would be terrified facing those odds. Then why did you not surrender when logic suggested it was the only survivable option?" Thalnex asked. Andrew smiled slightly before answering, "And because fear and surrender are not the same thing, and we were more afraid of what we would become if we gave up freedom. Without fighting, and sometimes the fear of losing yourself is stronger than the fear of death." "A very human perspective," Thalnex observed. Maybe Andrew said. "Or maybe it is just a perspective that gets forgotten when you have been powerful for too long." The Council fleet departed 3 days later and jumped to faster than light speed, leaving humanity to process what had happened. Celebrations were bittersweet because 7,000 people were dead, including Captain Daniel. And the cost had been terrible, but humanity had survived and forced the Council to treat them as equals. 2 months later, technology transfers began arriving, and human scientists started the long process of understanding quantum navigation and antimatter systems and advanced medicine, knowing it would take generations to fully absorb. And across the galaxy, something shifted as species that had watched. Humanity's defiance began asking their own questions, and the first petition for autonomous status came from the Kelvin Union, followed by others in a growing chorus demanding the same treatment. 5 years later, Ambassador Helen Carter attended a gathering of the Autonomous Species Coalition, and 17 species had successfully negotiated similar terms, with more in talks. The Council still existed, but it was changing slowly and painfully, but undeniably changing. "Did you ever imagine one word would lead to this?" asked Ambassador Kevin Norrell of the Kelvin Union. Helen thought about everything that had happened, and about all the people who had refused to accept that power meant legitimate authority, I think. "We imagined something had to change," Helen said. "We just did not know how much one act of defiance could accomplish." On Earth, young Emma Hayes graduated from the Naval Academy at 17 and was assigned to a new frigate named Liberty in honor of her father's sacrifice. "Your father would be proud," Captain Linda Shaw said while pinning on Emma's insignia. "I hope so," Emma replied. "I'm going to spend my life making sure his sacrifice mattered. It already does," Linda assured her. "Everyday humans wake up free" is his legacy. In Council archives, there was a document that drew considerable attention. From scholars studying the transformation of galactic civilization, it was humanity's response to the tribute demand, and just one word that had changed everything. No.